Hello, and welcome to Buxton Books. I'm Polly Buxton, coming to you from Buxton Books in Charleston, South Carolina, 160 King Street. And we are just thrilled to be welcoming and for a virtual pre-publication discussion with Kimmery Martin. Kimmery Martin is a favorite author of the booksellers here at Buxton Books. And we've been honored to support her with her previous two novels and now with her forthcoming Doctors and Friends. If you're watching this in real time, the book comes out on Tuesday, November 9th. So countdown to Pub Day. Kimmery is going to be joining us here at Buxton Books later this month, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. So mark your calendars. I always want to look to make sure I get it right. Monday, November 15th at 5 p.m. Come see us. We're so thrilled to be gathering again in person, carefully, safely. We have our doors closed right now so that I can be mask free, but we're just so thrilled that Kimmery's coming, and we're so thrilled that Doctors and Friends is going to be out, and so that everyone will get to read what we've gotten to enjoy. It is a eerily prescient and timely book is what Newsweek said, but I think it's important to say that she wrote this prior to the pandemic, and that it is a book of hope and friendship. So let me tell you, those of you who are not familiar with Kimmery, that she is an emergency medicine doctor turned novelist whose works of medical fiction have been praised by the Harvard Crimson, Southern Living, the Charlotte Observer, and the New York Times. She has starred reviews for Doctors and Friends from Publishers Weekly, Library Journal, and Booklist. Booksellers, anyone who was given an advance copy is just absolutely raving about it and saying it is the book that they needed to read during the pandemic. And Kimmery and I will be talking a little bit more about that after her presentation. Please enter your questions if you have anything that you would like her to answer for us to discuss. We would love to hear your questions for Kimmery. She says nothing is off limits. So you can ask her medical questions, COVID questions, literary questions. She's just an absolutely brilliant and lovely person, and we can't wait to hear what she has to say. Doctors and Friends incorporates unexpected wit and a deeply relatable cast of characters who provoke both laughters and tears. That is the official way to describe the book, and I think it is right on point. So I'm going to turn this over and say welcome, Kimmery Martin. Thank you, and congratulations on the forthcoming Doctors and Friends. We are fans of your work, and we're excited to see where you take us with this book.
Thank you, Polly. That was such a nice introduction that I kind of want to end the talk right now before I mess it up. That was really lovely. Thank you. And actually, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you guys, this is the first time that I have talked live about Doctors and Friends. I'm going to pretend that you're actually with me in real life at this moment. And that kind of leads to its own set of awkwardness, because I was kind of reminded of the Saturday Night Live skit with Kristen Wiig and one of the Jonas Brothers, where they play this couple in a bar after a pandemic ends, and they can't really remember how to behave as humans in public. And so they get everything a little bit wrong. They say weird things to each other, and they ask the piano player to play Take Me Out to the Ball Game so they can dance. And that's basically me. I don't really remember how to do this. And one of the unfortunate side effects of having done so many virtual talks over the last year and a half is that I have developed this awkward, high-pitched laugh at my own jokes, because everybody's always muted except for me. So I can't tell if anyone thinks anything is funny that I'm saying. So I laugh at see, I'm going to really try hard not to do it now. And on that note, actually, the other thing I just thought of is that I have done a lot of television interviews over the last year and a half, because not only am I a physician, but I'm a physician who's written a pandemic novel, and I developed COVID myself. So that I found at one point about 6 months ago, I was getting a lot of requests for television interviews. And the way they do these taped ahead ones is they might interview me for 30 or 40 minutes, and then they condense it down into a 2-minute segment. And I know this. And I still cannot stop myself from saying unbelievably stupid things that become good sound bites. So the first one that I watched, it aired and I saw my face against this blue screen, and orbiting around my head were these little whizzing COVID balls. And then I opened my mouth and spoke. And the quote that they chose was me saying, "I am really super dizzy all the time." And I did, in fact, say that. I had many intelligent medical things I planned to say too, but that's for obvious reasons the quote that they chose. So all that to say, this might not be the most polished author talk that you ever hear. Well, before I get into the specifics of the new book, I have learned on my other book tours that people are usually interested in the backstories, both of the novel and the author. They like to know about the author's background a little bit. So in my case, I get a lot of questions about my path to publication. As you just heard, I have been really blessed to have these two great career passions in my life. And one is obviously literature. The other is the practice of medicine. And so I worked as an ER doctor for about 15 years. And I do really love the practice of emergency medicine. I found that there was something really deeply rewarding about being able to make an immediate impact in the life of another human being who was ill or injured or suffering. And I like the camaraderie that you have with the people you work with in an emergency department. I like the procedures and the problem solving and the technical challenges and all of that stuff about emergency medicine. But all my life, I have also been a really devoted, obsessive, fanatical reader. And I had this secret dream of one day being able to do the thing that has given me so much joy in my life when other people have done it. So I wanted to try to write a book. And I wrote my first novel, The Queen of Hearts, without any background in writing at all, because I get a lot of questions about what kind of writing I did before that publication. And it was a really long and humbling process, both the process of learning how to write and the process of getting published. So that book, which I see Polly has some copies of, is about a friendship between a cardiologist, hence the title, and a trauma surgeon, and this big, startling secret that exists between the two of them. And after a very long struggle to get it written and published, it actually wound up being quoted in the New York Times, and it completely changed the course of my life. I started devoting a lot more time to writing. Then my second novel, which Polly also has, The Antidote for Everything, was published in 2020, and it released right as COVID released. So that kind of curtailed the book tour a little bit. But that novel was also about a deep friendship between two doctors and what goes spectacularly wrong between them when one of them is unjustly fired. So all of my books are a little bit of spin-offs of one another. I wouldn't exactly call them a series, but some of the minor characters in each book go on to become protagonists in the next book. And that's what's happened with Doctors and Friends. And this is where it gets kind of interesting. So as Polly said, the first thing I really want you to know about this book is the timing, because I first had the idea for the book in 2018, and I researched and drafted and did most of the writing in 2019. I sold it to the publisher in 2019. And that is important because Doctors and Friends is about an infectious disease doctor at the CDC. And she is traveling with her group of medical school girlfriends in the midst of what becomes a brand new worldwide viral pandemic. So initially, my publisher was going to pitch this as The Hot Zone meets Sophie's Choice. And if you've read those two books, that's going to give you some idea of the central plot line. Because when the main character's two children become deathly ill, she happens to have access to one dose of an experimental antiviral medication. and she has to select which child will receive it. So, as is often the case with novels, there are real events that inspired this storyline. Implausible though it might actually sound. So many years ago, I read The Great Influenza, which is John Barry's classic nonfiction account of the really calamitous 1918 influenza epidemic. And this book had an outsized impact on my imagination. I mean, this was an incredibly virulent outbreak that was so bad that you would have young adults who were fine in the morning and dead by the evening. So I was sort of envisioning some kind of a super virus for my novel, combining maybe the hemorrhagic nature of Ebola with the contagiousness of measles and the pulmonary devastation of certain forms of influenza. And I started crowdsourcing a group of infectious disease doctors and virologists and epidemiologists in some of my online medical groups. And I asked these guys, okay, I want you to name the characteristics of the single worst virus that you could imagine. And I did not wind up using all of their suggestions because my fictional people had to be able to overcome this thing in the end. But I used a lot of them. And originally I was going to have the book be about a form of influenza, but then I decided it would be confusing to have a real virus mingled with fictional things that I made up. So I shifted it to a wholly fictional virus in the book. Now, in early 2019, as part of the research that I was doing, I read Richard Preston's nonfiction book, Crisis in the Red Zone. And this was about the 2014 Ebola outbreak in Western Africa. And this idea sort of started to coalesce for me. So you might have read actually news accounts of what happened in that 2014 outbreak, because there was this really widely reported story of an aid camp that Samaritan's Purse was running in Sierra Leone. And two of the workers at the camp, a doctor and another medical worker, contracted Ebola, which is a highly lethal virus. And coincidentally, the director of the Ebola ward, who was a man named Kent Brantley, happened to have a single dose of this experimental drug called ZMapp. There were 6 doses or something like that that existed in the entire world at this time. And none of them had ever been given to a human being before. And one of them just coincidentally turns up at his camp. And if you want to know how that happened, you should read Crisis in the Red Zone, because it is a really fascinating story with a lot of ethical implications. But at the time, ZMapp was almost theoretical. It had never been given to anybody. And Dr. Brantley faced this really brutal decision, which is which of his 2 deathly ill colleagues should he treat? Or should he treat either one of them at all with this untested drug, because the drug itself could kill them? And he wrote that if he did nothing, they would both almost certainly die. And then if he administered the drug, that might kill them. And it posed ethical questions of its own, because it would be offering a treatment to these 2 privileged people that other people who were also dying of Ebola did not have. So I read this account, and I almost immediately thought, what if those 2 people had been his children? You know, it's bad enough that he had to pick between his colleagues. And I know that makes me sound like a psychopath, but I do want you guys to remember that the mantra of all fiction writers is to give your characters the worst possible moral dilemma that you can. And then you just up the ante even further within the limits of plausibility. So that's kind of where I was when I started writing the book to begin with. And I will say the initial outbreak in my book does not occur in Sierra Leone. Patient 0 is a doctor from the Central African country of Chad who is traveling to Northern Africa, Morocco, when he becomes ill. So for background, I was interviewing doctors who practice in Chad, and 2 of the doctors I talked to are these incredibly admirable people. He's an ER doctor, she's an OBGYN, and they're raising their 5 children and treating their patients in what seems like almost unimaginable circumstances at times. And after I was communicating with these two people for a while, I was astonished to learn that they had been through a real life scenario that was very similar to the one in my book, when all of their children were exposed to rabies. And there turned out not to be enough immunoglobulin in the entire country to treat more than one person. So, I mean, just think about that for a minute. Normally, I don't tell people the outcome of these two doctors' stories because I'm hoping that they will write a memoir and get it published of their stories. But I asked them and they said it was all right for me to talk about this in my book talk. So the scenario was that their two older children were both either bitten or scratched directly by what turned out to be a rabid cat. At first, they didn't realize it, but the cat began exhibiting symptoms, and then 3 days later, it died. So at that point, the clock was ticking because once rabies reaches your brain, it is basically never survivable. And the more innervated the body part that is bitten, the faster it will reach your brain. So in this case, the little boy was bitten, I think, on the forearm, and the little girl was scratched on her ear. And the way that you treat rabies, which has a 100% cure rate if it is treated properly, is that you inject immunoglobulin around the wound, and then you administer this series of vaccinations spread out over 28 days. And if you want to guarantee survival from the rabies virus, pretty much the maximum time that can elapse between exposure and symptom onset is 6 days. So at this point, 3 days had already gone by, and the dad just springs into action. He starts calling every hospital, every pharmacy, every medical clinic, every supplier in the country and in the surrounding countries. And these guys are missionary doctors. They have almost no money, but they're trying to make plans to fly in some of the drug from neighboring Cameroon or Kenya, and they're having all kinds of trouble. If you want to courier in a medical supplier or anyone into this country, you have to have a visa and you have to go to N'Djamena, which is the capital, and it's just bureaucratic and difficult. So he keeps thinking that he has access to the drug, and it keeps falling through. He calls the American embassy in Chad. They have actually plenty of immunoglobulin, but they refuse to hand it out on the grounds that this is an incredibly expensive drug. They only have enough for their own agency workers. They don't cover NGOs or any random Americans in the country. If they use their drug, they can't get more because of budgetary constraints. So ultimately, they just point blank refuse to give the immunoglobulin to this family. They're also working with their medical evacuation company. And the medevac company calls the dad back after a day or two and informs him that they have a plan. And their plan is that they will fly the father with the 4 children, whose ages are 8, 6, 4, and 2, to Nairobi, where, by the way, there is no immunoglobulin, but instead they're going to be altered in alternative treatment. So remember, there's a 100% cure rate with immunoglobulin and vaccine, and there's a 100% fatality rate without it, just about. There is this other thing called the Milwaukee Protocol, which involves an intensive care unit and a lot of other expensive antiviral drugs and so forth. But basically, if you get rabies and you start showing symptoms, you're going to die. So think about the position that this father is in. He repeatedly keeps being told he has access to the drug, and it always turns out to be false hope. Then finally, he hears that there is a clinic in N'Djamena who has immunoglobulin, and they say it will cost $3,500, which he does not have. He tells them that he will get the money if they will give the drug right away, and he'll get the money the next day. They say no. So the dad emails the clinic back and CCs everybody he knows, and his church in America offers to pay for the drug. So that's a huge relief that they can get the immunoglobulin that night. But then the dad does the math and he realizes there is only enough medication for one of his kids. I can't even imagine, what that would be like. He has to make a decision. And so he chooses his daughter, his little girl, because her bite is closer to her brain. And he's going to try to fly his little boy to Paris, although that will be outside the 6-day window. So in desperation, he tries one final thing. He goes online and he puts out this desperate plea to a Facebook group of more than 15,000 emergency medicine physicians. Now, these are people who fully understand what the consequences of all this are. And they spring into action. They start calling senators and representatives in the White House and CNN and Fox News and the Department of Justice and the State Department and every American embassy in Africa and every military base in Africa. Within an hour, they raised enough money to charter a private jet, if there were one obtainable, that could get in and out of the country. But the upshot is that less than an hour after these ER doctors start putting pressure on people, the American embassy in N'Djamena agrees to turn over their immunoglobulin to this family, and the children are saved. So that story, although I had not heard it at the time that I wrote the first draft of Doctors and Friends, wound up having a huge impact on me as I was revising the scenes in the novel where my fictional character has to pick between her children. And at that time, I had spent many months interviewing doctors and scientists at the CDC and at the NIH and at the WHO, and some of them are quite well known. One of my consultants suggested using camels as the fictional virus, as the vector for my fictional virus. And I actually had the chance to travel to Spain and Morocco, where portions of the novel are set. So I got to meet some camels. And others of these consultants helped me refine the clinical characteristics of the virus. And at this point, which was very early 2020, the book was kind of shaping up to be this not implausible, but still very dramatic, cautionary tale about a pandemic. You know, this could really happen. I kept explaining to everybody that was unfortunate enough to ask me what I was writing. I said, you know, the world periodically experiences major viral pandemics, and I don't know if we're prepared for this one. And I was on the very beginning of my book tour for the Antidote for Everything. And actually, Polly, I got to see you, and I think I even talked about this book there. I mean, so I was joking with everybody that we were going to always need to elbow bump instead of shaking hands from now on. And then I flew to New York City, and I was in New York in the very beginning of March 2020. And right around then, it was becoming increasingly obvious that COVID was going to be a really significant pandemic. So my book tour was canceled. I flew home, and the publisher and I had to make a big decision about whether or not to go forward with this book. You know, we realized that people were going to have pandemic fatigue by the time the book came out, because there's a long lag time between writing a book and getting it published. And we thought, you know, who's going to want to read a book about a pandemic after actually enduring one? And who's going to be able to read a book about a pandemic without applying the filter of their own experience through it? There's a chapter actually in the book called Every Armchair Virologist in America, which is all of us now, right? Because we all know a lot more about this subject than we did before, and we all have strong opinions about this subject. So my editor did decide to go forward with publication, but she had a request for me, which is that she wanted me to shift the storyline a little bit so that its focus was not entirely on the doctor who has to choose between her children, but also on some of the other physicians in the book. So, because my editor said, you know, we have all lived through a pandemic, but we will not have all lived through a pandemic working on the front lines. So I revised the novel to make two of the characters point of view characters who previously had been a little bit more minor. So they were in the same scenes, but now you were seeing things from inside their head. One of them was an ER doctor in New York City, and the other one was an OBGYN in San Diego. I also included the urologist who is the main character in the Antidote for Everything. She's not a point of view character, but she's a very pivotal character in this book. And I made other changes. I added Zoom scenes to the book. Those weren't in there originally. And then along the way, as I mentioned, I also contracted COVID myself, and I developed long-term neurologic and cardiac symptoms after that. So I certainly get the concept of pandemic fatigue. And I know that's going to be especially true by the time you guys read this novel. I do want to emphasize several things about it. However, the novel does have some humor in it. And as an illustration of humor, I can tell you that the societal and governmental response to the fictional virus in the book was highly functional and very effective, and also very unified. So that's funny, right? We did toss around the idea of changing the societal response in the book to be more reflective of the reality that we all endured. But ultimately, we left it alone. And I think it serves as an illustration of, what might have been had things been a little different. Now, there are, of course, a lot of millions of deaths in this fictional pandemic in the book. But there are also children and work relationships and romances in the book, and those things are inherently funny. My own children have been really captivated with the idea that this mom in the book has to pick between her kids, and they bring this up all the time, usually when one of their siblings has landed in some kind of trouble, like, now you would pick me, Mom, right? And I would say also that the book does contain some sweetness. All three of my novels have revolved around this concept of friendship as a really fundamental human relationship. And in particular, in this book, the friendships were inspired by my own real life group of seven women doctors. We all went to medical school together. So none of these guys represents any particular character, but there are a few of our own real life stories in there. And then finally, after COVID hit, I did have to make a decision about other events and portrayals in the book that turned out not to match our own very peculiar reality. So there were some elements in the book that I think turned out to be startlingly realistic, but there were some things that were really different from what we experienced in real life. And my editor suggested, and I agree, that the right way to end this story is on a note of optimism and hope. And that is the beautiful thing about fiction. Unlike real life, the author controls the ending. So despite our own real world endurance of a pandemic all these months, I would, of course, be so grateful if y'all would consider reading Doctors and Friends. And of course, so grateful if you would consider supporting Buxton Books with your purchase of a book, if you choose to get one. And I really hope to see you in a couple of weeks when I am there in person. Thank you guys very much for listening.
Oh, that's amazing. I don't want to give too many spoilers away, but I loved how you talked about it. And actually, some of the questions that we had, you already addressed to some degree, just as the booksellers and personally. I think a lot about the timing and the edits. That's absolutely fascinating. But that was interesting that you worked, because I knew that you'd already turned this in, but you and your editor worked. And so tell us a little bit more. It was the optimistic and hopeful ending was something that you, I can't imagine it ending in any other way. So I'm wondering, did you just enhance that optimism? Did you feel like a need to go in and add a little more hope to that?
Well, that is a really good question, Polly, because I didn't want to end the book the way it ends now. In my very first proposals, I had it with a completely different, more medically probably plausible ending. And my editor said, and this was even before the pandemic, she said, absolutely not. She's like, you need to give your reader some gratification and you need to give your reader some hope. Now, I'm not saying nothing negative happens in the book, because it's an intense read at times, but I realized that she was completely right. I think it would have been too grim to have everyone die, right?
Yeah.
In a novel like this. And I became really attached to the characters. I'm not normally super precious about what happens to fictional people, but I really wanted these people to succeed. So I'm grateful to my editor for, forcing a happier ending than the one I had envisioned originally.
Well, so that brings me to a little bit of a question about the reaction. So my entire take on this is reactions from the book world, from both readers and booksellers, and how we feel about it. And just some very well-known booksellers have weighed in so heavily that Mary Laura Philpott and Anne Bogle both gave you really wonderful shout outs about how this was the book that they needed to read. And I think that that is a feeling from a lot of booksellers and readers. I know that's going to happen. What was the reaction from the medical community?
Well, so the medical readers of this book were the first people ever to read it, because while I was writing it, I had a terrible fear of getting things medically wrong. And I'm sure that I did. I do want to add a disclaimer about that. There are probably medical mistakes in the book. And there's definitely some stuff where I took a little creative license to, up the drama somewhat. But this book was written about fields that I don't know very much about, with the exception of emergency medicine. So I did really love the character of Compton. We can talk about that in a minute. But I don't know, I'm nowhere near the level of expert when it comes to virology or even infectious disease. And so a lot of the stuff that I needed help with was fairly technical. And I was lucky enough to have this big group of mainly female physicians who helped me. And some of them just answered a question. Some of them read a passage related to their specialty. Some of them read the whole thing. But the first feedback that I got from the doctors who read the book early was often that they found themselves laughing and crying. Some of them even offered to write me blurbs or endorsements, saying, this book wound up mirroring a lot of my own real life experiences. So that was good. I'm more nervous about what they think than about what anybody else thinks.
Oh, that's interesting. That's great. I can imagine. I would feel like that was from your peers, from your professional peers on that. Well, I guess it goes both ways. You're also interested in your peers in the book world, but that is really interesting to hear that there was such positive feedback. I know that your readers who purchase your books from us, there are a lot of medical readers who absolutely follow what you write and read. Before we go, I want to talk about some of your other books too, and some of the themes that go through all of your novels. But I was bringing back to the Hot Zone meets Sophie's Choice, which was your original idea. First of all, that's just, it was unimaginable.
Yeah.
Now, sadly, I think we can imagine what that would be like. But talking about the experimental part of the experimental medicine, and it's such a conversation that's going on now, and how there's this dichotomy in the public where some people are absolutely so eager to join the experiment or to be the first to get for us, the first to get a vaccine, whereas others are legitimately almost frozen with fear about that they would rather take the known negative rather than take a chance at a somewhat unknown positive. And I fall into the very pro-vaccine category, just personally. But so it's such an interesting dynamic, and I was wondering how you feel about that, both as an author, where these themes are in your book, and also just as a doctor.
Well, it first of all, it was surreal to have thought of this plot line involving an experimental drug and then seeing that mirrored so often in reality over the next year and a half. I am sympathetic to everybody really here. Obviously I'm pro-vaccine as well. It's very hard to find a doctor who isn't. But I get the hesitation because first of all, most of us are not really well versed in, pharmaceutical medicine or virology or, the history of vaccination. And all people hear is that suddenly we have a brand new vaccine and it came out really fast. And so I think I could legitimately talk about this for a long time, but what I usually try to tell people is it actually wasn't fast. We had mRNA technology in the works for 2 decades, including there were other vaccines in the process of being developed for cancer and for Zika and for influenza and various things using the same technology. So it was tested for a long time before COVID ever happened. And I also try to reassure people about the timing of side effects with vaccines, which always happen within a period of weeks if they're going to happen, and they're incredibly rare. But what's not incredibly rare is side effects to viruses, as I am living proof of now. Now, people can have vaccine side effects, but they're so uncommon compared to the risk of viruses. And as human beings, it's just really hard for us to evaluate relative risk because things get magnified in our mind. We hear more news stories about one thing or the other, or we hear information from one source or another. And so I do welcome questions from anybody on medical topics. I have tried to write on my Facebook a lot about some of the medical phenomenon going on during COVID. I'm getting ready to write a piece right now on the pros and cons of vaccinating children under the age of 12, for example, and hopefully in a way that'll simplify a little bit of the medical understanding behind these things. But I am sympathetic to the idea that we don't know everything, and sometimes fear of the unknown can be paralyzing.
Yeah, I do, and I don't want to go too deep down into this because the story itself, I think, is we have our own personal and collective stories for COVID. This is a fictional story, as you said, that you wrote prior to COVID. And at the same time, it's impossible not to draw parallels. It's impossible not to think about, and even in the positive ways, in the way that there is hope, in the way that the story moves. And our story's not finished yet. So I like to, I'm not named Polly for nothing. So I have an optimism that comes that the story's not finished yet. And so I think it's really extraordinary what's going on in the medical community. And one of the questions, I'm going to kind of reword it a little bit, but how to remain positive and oriented. I think this is towards the medical community, but it actually, I think, goes to each one of us. I think how to remain positive and oriented when processing and coping with so much tragedy and so much fear around us, actually knowing the extent to which pandemic can wreak havoc and death. And so what do we do? How to remain oriented and focused within that, both in your fictional characters when you're writing about them, but also in reality right now?
Well, I think that's a really insightful question. In fiction, to some degree, it was easier because, again, of course, I can make anything happen. I am the god of this particular universe. I can do what I want there. And so, real life, though, of course, it's difficult at times. But if people take anything away from this novel, I would like them to take away all the absolute beneficence and warm-heartedness and love there is amongst human beings. Because even through this terrible pandemic, we have accomplished an incredible amount to alleviate suffering. I volunteered at a vaccine clinic during the early days of 2021. And I remember thinking, if an alien came down from space and landed right here in the middle of this clinic, they would think that human beings are the most cooperative creatures in the universe, because there were hundreds of people. This is one of those big drive-through ones. Hundreds of people not getting paid, all functioning as a little cog in this big wheel. All these cars rolling through at this time. This was the very first days. And so it was a lot of elderly people, and they were so grateful for this chance to get back out into society. So you think about all the things that had to take place for that to happen, all the scientists, all the doctors, all the, medical research, all the volunteers on the ground, all the distribution. We came together and we did the best thing that we could do to try to stop the pandemic. And I have seen countless examples of people, both pro and anti-vaccine, helping other people during this pandemic, whether it's bringing groceries to somebody elderly who can't get out, or, helping a child who's struggling with virtual learning, or whatever it is. we do care about each other. I mean, we are good people. And I think that comes through in the novel, and also hopefully I think it comes through in real life.
Oh, I love that. In fact, I think that is one of the greatest takeaways from real life and from your novels is that that there are these points of light that keep happening. As dark as some days are, you get up and there are these points of light, and somehow there is an even a greater appreciation for those points of light and for that hope, because might have been that a conversation, even could you imagine us doing these virtual conversations and these virtual events before? And I mean, it's really kind of extraordinary. I mean, we are truly so resilient, and we do come together. And I think it's so easy sometimes to focus on the negative as opposed to all of the positive that comes out of things. I have to talk about something because that is not about the pandemic, and it is actually not about your incredible plots and your suspenseful plots and your witty, absolutely brilliant dialogue, that the way that you write. I mean, you really are an extraordinary writer. So by the way, if you're wondering, this book, you will turn the page, you will want to know what happens, you will be surprised, you will laugh. That is all true. But one of my favorite things about your books are your covers. It's just, so I judge a book by its cover actually quite often, especially when it comes to me giving a book, or the books that I like to stack up next to my, the ones that end up being face out or get to stack up on my desk or on my bedside table. Can you see some of these? The Queen of Hearts, if people can see the Queen of Hearts, look at I'm just gonna hold this up in case you are new to this. Look at the Queen of Hearts. It's extraordinary. Now, Antidote for everything. You look, I mean, can you see the complexity of this? It's absolutely extraordinary. And now Doctors and Friends. What a cover. And these are all by the same designer. Tell us who she is.
Her name's Colleen Reinhardt. She's a graphic designer with Penguin Random House.
Well, shout out to Colleen Reinhardt. I think she's amazing. Are these, I know you don't get a whole lot of vote on this, so somehow you won the cover lottery, which I think
so lucky.
Absolutely amazing. I think they're amazing. Are there original pieces of art?
Yeah, so I guess some of it is, and some of it's elements that she just pulls in. Authors don't get to pick their covers, and you may have heard me tell this story the last time I was at Buxton, but I did get asked what I wanted in the cover for the Queen of Hearts. And if you hold it up again, I asked for a vintage drawing of an anatomic heart on the cover because the main character is a cardiologist. And so Penguin was nervous about putting a naked heart on the cover. So the designer told me she covered it in this mixture of flowers that is both funereal and celebratory to illustrate the circle of life in a medical practice. And there's birds and bees in there too. And that cover wound up getting so much attention, probably on Bookstagram and everywhere. It was on best cover lists. And the concept was so successful that the publisher came back to me and said they wanted to continue the idea of having the cover art reflect the medical specialty of the protagonist. And I was like, you all know my next book is about a urologist, right? So that's a lot of flowers that I don't know. So they did it a little differently than I would have. I made some obscene suggestions and they shot that down with.
So anyway, you can't quite tell that's what's going on here. But it reminds me, I think I showed you this before we went live. I love this book by Victoria Johnson, and it was shortlisted, but also you see all the botanical in it. Anyway, so this is botany and medicine in the Garden of the Early Republic. But I just love the connection of botany and medicine also as well. And I just think it's absolutely beautiful. And so, a book with a beautiful cover makes a really great gift. It's a wow factor when you open it up. And so I am going to suggest, please shop at independent bookstores, buy new books from independent booksellers, and you are buying into that whole ecosystem of writing and publishing and book selling that's so important. When you buy a new book from Kimmery Martin, this is how we get news stories from Kimmery. This is how we decide who to publish and when to publish. And we report these numbers back to Penguin Random House, and we will get to have a 4th novel. But right now, this is the way you vote. You buy Kimmery's books, and hopefully you buy them from Buxton Books. We're going to have signed copies because Kimmery is going to be coming in the store in person Monday, November 15th. That's not too far away. 5 p.m. Come have a glass of wine or a cup of tea, and if you can't make it, then you can always get in touch with Buxton Books at hello@buxtonbooks.com or give us a call. You can also purchase online, but I think you will be personalizing books. So if you would like to have a personalized book, they make extraordinary gifts. Also, just buy a stacked one. You don't even have to decide to whom to give them until later. You can just buy a stack of signed books and give them out. These books are so wonderful, and thank you for sharing. And they are timely and prescient, and they are hopeful and beautifully written. And we're so excited. Countdown to your pub date next Tuesday. Give us a call, 843-723-1670. Send us an email. Stop by and see us at 160 King Street. We will ship anywhere. And Kimmery, we're so looking forward to seeing you. We're going to be sharing this recording and taking orders, and then looking forward to welcoming you on the 15th here in store. So best of luck to you. And the French say bon courage instead of saying good luck. And so I'm going to say that to you. Have courage for this, and bon courage to everyone who's here. Thank you for joining us at Buxton Books. And Kimmery, thank you for writing these novels.
Thank you, Polly, for having me. I'm really honored. Bye.
See you shortly. See you in just a few weeks. Bye.
Can't wait.